My name is Olivia Harper. I am 34 years old. If you have ever believed that the people who raised you would always stand on the same side of any line that mattered, you might understand why I am telling this story now. Family has a way of teaching you the hardest lessons at the moment you least expect them. I lived in the luxury lake community of Lake Forest, Illinois, in a modest but comfortable home with my 10-year-old daughter Emma. The water was always close enough to remind me that some things stay steady even when everything else shifts. I worked from home as a grant writer for a small environmental nonprofit, kept a predictable routine, and thought I had built a life that no longer required me to prove my worth to anyone. That illusion cracked on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when the certified letter arrived. The envelope carried the seal of a family law firm I had never heard of. Inside were documents my mother had signed, giving my older sister temporary authority over decisions involving Emma's schooling and medical care. The papers claimed I had become emotionally unreliable, and that my older sister was better positioned to provide stability. There was no warning, no conversation, no request for my side of anything. The language was cold and precise, the kind that makes you read the same paragraph 3 times because your mind refuses to accept what the words actually say. I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread out and felt the floor tilt beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with the lake outside. I did not call my mother right away. I have always been the kind of person who measures a situation before I speak because words once said cannot be pulled back. Instead, I read every line again, looking for the exact place where my life had been rewritten without my consent. The documents referenced witness statements and long-standing concerns, but never named who had provided them or what those concerns actually were. That absence told me more than the words themselves. Someone had been building a case against me in secret, and my mother had put her signature on it. When I finally picked up the phone, it was my older sister's number I dialed first. She answered on the second ring, her voice light and almost cheerful, as though she had been expecting the call. I asked her what she thought she was doing. She did not deny anything. She said the papers were necessary because I had been struggling, and Emma deserved consistency. When I asked what struggle she was referring to, she listed small things I had shared in confidence over the past year: my exhaustion after a difficult project at work, a stretch when Emma had trouble sleeping a moment, I had cried on the phone after a bad day. She presented those ordinary moments as evidence that I could no longer manage on my own. Her tone never rose. She sounded reasonable, almost concerned, the way someone sounds when they have already decided they are the hero of the story. I told her I would be speaking with a lawyer. She said that was probably wise, and that she hoped we could keep everything civil for Emma's sake. The call ended with her saying she loved me and that this was for the best. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after she hung up, listening to the quiet in my own house. The betrayal was not loud. It was measured, strategic, and wrapped in the language of care. That made it harder to fight, because anyone listening from the outside would hear concern instead of control. I spent the rest of that afternoon and evening reading the documents again and again. The legal papers had been filed in the county court that served our lake community. They asked for a temporary order granting my older sister decision-making power until a full hearing could be scheduled. My mother's signature appeared on an attached affidavit stating she had witnessed my declining capacity over several months. There were no specific dates, no concrete examples, only the general impression that I was no longer the steady person they had always known. The absence of detail was its own kind of accusation. It left room for anyone reading it to fill in whatever story they wanted to believe. The next morning, I drove to a small cafe that overlooked the lake, the kind of place where the coffee is strong and the tables are far enough apart that conversations do not carry. I needed neutral ground before I spoke to my mother. When I called her, her voice was calm, in the same way my older sister's had been. She said she had signed the papers because she was worried about me, and about Emma. When I asked why she had not talked to me first, she said she had not wanted to upset me further. The conversation circled the same ground 3 times, without ever landing on a single specific incident that justified what they had done. Every time I pressed for evidence, she returned to the same vague phrases about stability and protection. By the end of the call, I realized she was not going to change her mind. She had already chosen her side, and it was not mine. I did not raise my voice during that conversation. I have learned that anger gives the other person something to point to later. Instead, I asked her one final question, whether she truly believed I was a danger to my own child. She hesitated for the first time. Then she said she believed my older sister was better equipped to handle difficult decisions right now. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what was happening. This was not about Emma's well-being. This was about power, and about the story my mother and my older sister had decided to tell themselves about who I was. I left the cafe and walked along the lake path for nearly an hour. The water was still and grey under an overcast sky. I kept replaying the phone calls in my mind, looking for the exact moment when the people I had trusted most had stopped seeing me as a full person and started seeing me as a problem to be managed. The legal papers were only the visible part. Beneath them was something older, something that had been growing in silence for years. I did not yet know what that something was, but I knew I could not afford to look away from it any longer. That evening, I called my closest friend, Alyssa Bennett. She lived 2 streets over in the same lake community and had known me since we moved here 6 years earlier. I told her what the papers said and what my mother and older sister had claimed. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked if I wanted her to come over. I said no, not yet. I needed to think clearly first. She told me to call her any time, day or night, and that she believed me. Those words mattered more than I could say at the time. Over the next 2 days, I met with a family law attorney in downtown Lake Forest. She reviewed the documents and told me the temporary order had not yet been granted, which gave us a narrow window to respond. She also said the claims in the affidavit were unusually thin on specifics. That thinness could work in our favor if we could show the court that the accusations had no foundation. I left her office with a list of tasks and a strange mixture of dread and clarity. For the first time in years, I felt the sharp edge of a decision that belonged only to me. I began making notes of every conversation I could remember from the past year. Every time my older sister had offered unsolicited advice about Emma, every time my mother had gently suggested that I was carrying too much. None of those moments had seemed important when they happened. Now they lined up in a pattern I had refused to see. The legal papers were not a sudden attack. They were the result of a long, quiet campaign that had finally found its moment. On the 3rd day after the papers arrived, I received an unexpected call from the same law firm that had sent the documents. The paralegal on the line sounded professional and slightly rushed. She said they had additional materials to share and asked if I could come in the following afternoon. I agreed because refusing would have looked like avoidance. That meeting turned out to be the next place the ground shifted beneath me, though I did not know it yet. The following afternoon, I drove the short distance to the offices of the family law firm that had sent the papers. The building sat just off the main road through Lake Forest, close enough to the lake that you could see a sliver of water between the trees if you stood at the right angle in the parking lot. I parked, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and reminded myself to stay measured. Reacting with emotion would only give them more material to use against me. Elena Vargas. The attorney assigned to the matter met me in a small conference room with glass walls that overlooked a row of carefully trimmed hedges. She was in her late 40s, precise in her movements, and she placed a fresh stack of documents on the table between us before she sat down. The paralegal who had called me the day before hovered near the door with a notepad. as though this were a routine intake rather than the moment my family had chosen to rewrite my life on paper. Elena explained that my mother's affidavit had been supplemented with additional statements. She slid one across the table and asked me to read it. The statement was labeled Witness Summary and dated 3 weeks earlier. It described conversations I had supposedly had with my mother, in which I expressed doubt about my ability to parent Emma. The language was careful, almost clinical, and it never quoted me directly. When I asked who had provided the summary, Elena said the firm was not required to disclose the source at this stage. I asked if the statement had been recorded or transcribed from an actual conversation. She answered that it was a summary prepared for the court. I asked whether my mother had confirmed the accuracy of every detail before signing. Elena paused, then said my mother stood by the overall picture even if individual phrasing had been adjusted for clarity. That single sentence told me everything I needed to know about how the documents had been constructed. I took notes on a legal pad I had brought with me. I asked for copies of every page. I asked what timeline they expected for the temporary order hearing. Elena said the court had already set a date 2 weeks out, and that mediation was strongly recommended before then. She added in the same even tone that continuing to contest the matter could be viewed as unwillingness to prioritize Emma's stability. I thanked her for the information, collected the copies, and left without raising my voice or asking any further questions that could be twisted later. In the parking lot, I sat in my car with the engine off and read the new statement one more time. The words were not lies in the sense that someone had invented entire events. They were something quieter and more dangerous, ordinary moments stretched and reshaped until they no longer resembled the truth. That evening, I called Alyssa Bennett. She answered on the first ring and said she had been thinking about me all day. I asked if she could meet me at the small park that bordered the lake 2 streets from her house. She agreed without hesitation. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench facing the water with 2 paper cups of coffee beside her. I told her about the meeting and the supplemental statement. She listened the way she always did, without filling the silences. When I finished, she asked what I planned to do next. I said I was going to gather my own records, emails, text messages, notes from conversations, and speak with Emma's school principal to make sure no one there had been approached with similar concerns. Alyssa nodded and said she would help in any way she could. We sat in silence for a while, watching a pair of ducks move across the still water. Then Alyssa's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, frowned slightly, and answered. I could hear only her side of the conversation at first. She said hello, then listened for a long moment. Her expression changed. She said, "Margaret, I don't think this is something we should be discussing without Olivia present." My mother's name. Alyssa's voice stayed calm, but her free hand tightened around the edge of the bench. She listened again. Then she said, "I'm not comfortable being part of any conversation that questions Olivia's fitness as a parent when she isn't here to respond." Another pause. Her eyes met mine, and she mouthed the word, "speaker." I nodded. She tapped the screen and held the phone between us. My mother's voice came through clearly, the same measured tone she had used with me days earlier. She was speaking to my older sister. She said the papers had been filed exactly as discussed, and that the supplemental statement should be enough to show the court a pattern. My older sister answered that she had already spoken with 2 other neighbours who had noticed I seemed distant lately. My mother said that was helpful, and that they should collect anything else that could be framed as concern for Emma. She added that once the temporary order was in place, it would be easier to guide decisions without constant pushback. My older sister laughed softly and said she had always known I would eventually need this kind of structure. The call ended a minute later with my mother saying she would keep Alyssa updated if anything changed. Alyssa ended the call without saying goodbye. She set the phone down on the bench between us and looked at me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The wind off the lake moved the leaves above us in a slow, steady rhythm. I felt something settle inside me, not anger exactly, but a clear and cold recognition. The legal papers had never been about protecting Emma. They had been about control, and about the story my mother and my older sister had been telling each other for longer than I had allowed myself to see. The overheard conversation was not dramatic. It was ordinary, almost casual, the way two people speak when they believe no one else is listening. I thanked Alyssa for letting me hear it. She said she had not planned to answer the call in front of me, but that she was glad I had been there. She asked what I wanted to do with what we now knew. I told her I needed time to think, but that I would not be signing anything or agreeing to mediation until I understood the full scope of what had been said about me and why. She walked me back to my car and hugged me before I drove away. The hug was brief and steady, the kind that says more than words. When I got home, Emma was already asleep. I stood in her doorway for a long time, watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing. The house was quiet in the way houses are when a child is safe inside them. I thought about the 2 weeks until the hearing and about everything I would have to gather in that time. I thought about the neighbours my older sister had mentioned, and about how quickly a story can travel in a place as small and connected as our lake community. I thought about the cost of what I was about to do and whether I was willing to pay it. The next morning, I woke to a text from my mother. It was short and signed with her usual closing. She wrote that she hoped I was taking the situation seriously and that she was available to talk whenever I was ready. I did not reply. Instead, I opened my laptop and began a new document titled simply Timeline. I started with the date the certified letter arrived and worked backward, listing every conversation, every offer of help, every gentle suggestion that I was carrying too much. The list grew longer than I expected. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I understood that the legal papers were only the most recent chapter in a much older story. The crisis had forced the story into the open, and now I had no choice but to read it all the way through. I spent the next several days turning that timeline into something more substantial. I pulled every email and text I could find from the past 18 months, organized them by date, and added brief notes about what had actually happened in each conversation. The document grew thick. I met with Dr. Marcus Hale, Emma's school principal, in his office one afternoon after the final bell. He confirmed that no one from the school had received any concerns about Emma's well-being or my parenting. He also mentioned carefully that a few parents had asked him whether everything was all right at home, because they had heard I was going through something. I thanked him for his honesty and asked him to document our conversation. He agreed without hesitation. The gossip in the lake community moved the way water moves through a narrow channel, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. At the cafe, where I sometimes worked in the mornings, the barista who usually chatted with me about the weather now simply handed me my coffee and looked away. On the lake path, 2 women I had known for years crossed to the other side of the trail when they saw me coming. I did not chase them or ask what they had heard. I kept walking at the same steady pace I always used, because I had already decided that my energy belonged to the hearing and to Emma, not to defending myself against whispers. On the 6th day after the overheard call, an email arrived from an address I did not recognize. The sender was Lydia Grant, a name that meant nothing to me at first. She wrote that she had once worked with my older sister on a community fundraising project years earlier and had kept some old files. While sorting through them, she had found a recording of a phone call she believed I should hear. She attached both an audio file and a transcript. She added that she was sending it because she had been on the receiving end of similar family pressure once and had stayed silent too long. She hoped it would help. I played the recording with the volume low so Emma would not hear it from her room. The voices were unmistakably my mother and my older sister. The call had taken place almost 2 years earlier. My older sister said she was tired of watching me make decisions that affected all of us without consulting her. My mother agreed that I had become too independent since moving to the lake community, and that it would be better for everyone if decisions about Emma and about any future family resources were handled more collectively. My older sister laughed and said the easiest way to create that structure was to wait for the right moment and then present it as concern rather than control. My mother had paused and then said, as long as it protects the family name and keeps things stable. The recording ended there. I listened to it twice. Then I forwarded both the audio and the transcript to Elena Vargas with a single sentence. This changes the foundation of their claims. She called me within the hour. She said the recording, combined with Alyssa Bennett's statement about the more recent overheard conversation and Dr. Hale's confirmation from the school, created a clear pattern of coordinated effort rather than genuine concern. She asked if I wanted to proceed to the hearing or attempt one final negotiation. I told her I wanted the hearing. I had already given them every opportunity to speak directly with me, and they had chosen documents and whispers instead. The hearing took place on a Wednesday morning in a small courtroom in the county building. I sat beside Elena Vargas at one table. My mother and my older sister sat at the other table with their attorney. Neither of them looked at me when I entered. The judge reviewed the original papers, the supplemental statement, Alyssa's account of the call she had overheard Dr. Hale's letter, and the recording from 2 years earlier. My older sister's attorney argued that the recording was old and taken out of context. Elena responded that context was exactly what the recording supplied, a long-standing plan to use legal mechanisms and community perception to limit my autonomy under the guise of care. The judge asked my mother directly whether she still stood by the affidavit she had signed. My mother hesitated for the first time in any of these proceedings. She said she had signed it because she believed it was in Emma's best interest. The judge asked if she had any specific, recent incidents that demonstrated I was currently unfit. My mother said she did not. The judge denied the temporary order. She stated that the evidence presented did not meet the threshold for removing decision-making authority from a fit parent, and that the pattern of communication suggested the filings had been used as a tool rather than a protection. She dismissed the case without prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled on the same grounds without substantial new evidence. My mother and my older sister left the courtroom without speaking to me. Their attorney followed them out. I remained seated for a moment after they were gone, letting the quiet settle around the table where I sat with Elena Vargas. She told me the outcome was as clean as these matters ever get. I thanked her and walked out into the afternoon light. That evening I wrote 2 letters. The first was to my mother. I kept it short and factual. I told her that I would no longer discuss Emma or my life with her or with my older sister unless it was through legal counsel. I said I understood she had made her choice and that I was making mine. I wished her well and asked that she respect the boundary. The second letter was to my older sister. It said essentially the same thing with one additional line: I would not allow her to rewrite my story or Emma's story to suit her need for control. I mailed both letters the next morning and felt something release in my chest that had been tight for weeks. In the days that followed the gossip in the lake, community shifted. Some people avoided me still. Others, like Thomas Greer, who lived 2 houses down, stopped me on the path one morning and said he had heard conflicting versions of what happened and wanted to know if I was all right. I told him the legal matter had been resolved and that Emma and I were fine. He nodded and said he was glad. A few other neighbours reached out in quiet ways. The alliances that had once felt permanent had fractured, and the ones that remained were the ones I had chosen rather than inherited. Emma asked me one night after dinner whether everything was okay now. I told her the truth in the simplest words I could find. I said some people in our family had made decisions that hurt us, and that we had protected ourselves. I told her she would always be safe with me and that she could ask any question she wanted. She thought for a moment and then asked if we could still go to the lake on weekends. I said yes. She smiled and went back to her homework. That small, ordinary exchange felt like the first real breath I had taken in a long time. I have thought often about the recording Lydia Grant sent. She had not known me well yet. She had chosen to hand over something that could have been used against me, and had instead become the piece that exposed the plan. I wrote to thank her. She replied that she had spent too many years staying silent in her own family, and that she hoped the recording would spare someone else the same silence. Her choice became part of the evidence that allowed me to keep my life intact. The old support network is gone. My mother and my older sister no longer call, no longer text, no longer appear at community events where they know I will be. The silence is not comfortable, but it is honest. I have learned that peace does not arrive when everyone agrees with you. It arrives when you stop arranging your life around people who have already decided you are the problem. I still live in the same house by the lake in Lake Forest. Emma still asks questions about the world and still trusts that I will answer them. I still work on grants that matter to me. The difference is that I no longer wait for permission or approval before I make the next decision. I chose myself. I chose my daughter. I chose the quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly where the boundaries are and why they exist. That choice cost me the version of family I had carried for 34 years. It gave me back the version of myself I had almost forgotten how to trust. Thank you for listening to my story. Would you choose yourself?